This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I want to start today by asking you to pull up a mental map of Europe. Just picture it. Specifically, I want you to look at the big three: the UK, France, and Germany.
Three neighbors right on top of each other.
Exactly. And if you look at them in, say, the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you run into this massive historical puzzle, because even though they're geographically so close, they went in completely different directions.
It's pretty stark when you lay it out like that.
Right. I mean, look at the UK. They go all in on the Industrial Revolution. They become obsessed with economics, engines, trade.
Right.
Then you look at France. They aren't building steam engines. They're staging massive political revolutions. They're rewriting the social contract, chopping off heads, even changing the calendar.
And then, of course, there's Germany.
And then there's Germany. They're not industrializing yet, and they're not having a big revolution. Instead, they're sitting there producing the most incredibly dense, complex systems of philosophy the world has ever seen. Kant, Hegel, Fichte, the heavy hitters.
The ones that make college students, weep during finals week.
Exactly. And the question is just, why? Why did thinking look so different just a few hundred miles apart? Why did one neighbor pick up a wrench, one pick up a guillotine, and the other one pick up a metaphysics textbook?
To answer that, we're diving into a really fascinating source today. It's a text titled 111 Philosophy Cannot Walk Alone. And it offers a pretty radical corrective to how we usually learn this history.
It definitely moves away from that old great man theory, Kant was a genius, so we had good ideas.
Right. The source argues you can't separate the ideas from the dirt they grew in. The central concept we really need to unpack is something the author calls the three kingdoms of reason.
The three kingdoms of reason. It sounds a bit like a fantasy novel.
It does.
But it's actually a really practical framework, isn't it?
It is. The core premise is that reason, that thing we all think is just this universal constant, like gravity, it wasn't a monolith. It was a tool. And like any tool, it was used for three completely different purposes based on the desperate survival level needs of each nation at the time.
So we're looking at a time when theology, statehood, and reason were basically in a cage match for dominance.
In a way, yeah. And our mission today is to see how France, the UK, and Germany each picked up this tool of reason and built something totally different with it.
Okay, let's start with France. When I read the source material, it described France using reason as a blueprint. That feels very architectural.
It is social architecture. To understand France in this period, you have to look to political reality. As the Sun King, Louis XIV, you have a highly centralized state. The state is everything.
And into this environment, René Descartes walks in.
Right. And everyone knows that the bumper sticker, I think, therefore I am. But the implication of that was monumental. Descartes basically opened the door to the idea that you could find truth with a capital T through your own rational mind. You didn't necessarily need the church to interpret it for you.
Now, usually when people hear that, they think rebellion. They think, oh, they're going to overthrow the system.
But in France, they didn't use it to dismantle the system, not at first. They used it to optimize the system. The source points out that the French state effectively swallowed theology.
Swallowed it?
Yeah, they realized, hey, if the world is ordered mathematically and if God is rational, then
the king and the state should be rational too.
Precisely. In France, math and reason became tools for administration. It's about engineering society. They didn't need deep, mystical metaphysics about the nature of the soul. They needed a flowchart to run the country.
Which actually explains why the French Revolution looked the way it did. It wasn't just a riot, it was a redesign. I mean, they didn't just kill the king, they changed the calendar. They standardized measurements to the metric system.
It was total rationalization. Reason was the engine for social design. They were trying to build a utopia on a spreadsheet.
So France is using reason as a blueprint to engineer the state. Now, let's cross the channel to the UK. The source suggests they took a totally different approach. It almost sounds like they just opted out of the philosophical debate entirely.
In a sense, they did. They dropped out of the theology game.
How does a country just drop out of theology in the 1700s? That seems, well, impossible.
Well, this is where it gets a little technical, but it's crucial. You have to look at the influence of thinkers like Spinoza. Now, Spinoza is usually grouped with the continental rationalists, but his impact on the British mindset was specific. Spinoza basically dissolved God into nature.
Dissolved God into nature? What does that even mean?
He argued that God is the system. God is the math of the universe. God isn't a guy on a cloud judging you. God is the laws of physics.
Which for the time, is a pretty dangerous idea.
Extremely. But for British thinkers, Locke, Hume, that crowd, it had a very practical side effect.
Hmm.
If God is just nature and math, then we don't need to fight bloody religious wars about his personality. We can just study nature.
I see. It lowers the stakes. You stop worrying about the why and start looking at the how.
Drastically. They pivoted toward empiricism. Instead of asking, what is the true nature of the divine essence, they started asking, what can I measure? How does this piston move? How do we protect property rights?
This is the reason as a tool idea. It's not about saving your soul. It's about building a loom that works.
Correct. The British focused on the tangible. Reason became the tool for the Industrial Revolution. It was practical, economic, and technical. They left the heavy theological lifting to the continent and focused on what works.
It's interesting because we usually think of the Industrial Revolution as just, better technology. Like someone invented a machine and the world changed. But you're saying it was actually a philosophical shift first. They had to stop worrying about metaphysics to start worrying about mechanics.
Exactly. You can't invent the steam engine if you're paralyzed by worrying about the nature of the Holy Trinity. You need a different kind of focus.
So France is engineering the state with the blueprint. The UK is engineering the economy with the tool. And then we have Germany. And this is where the Three Kingdoms theory really shines, because Germany seems to be the outlier. They go inward.
Deeply inward. The source calls this reason as a fortress.
A fortress against what?
Against their neighbors. You have to remember, Germany didn't really exist yet. It was the Holy Roman Empire, which was a fragmented mess of little states, and they felt squeezed. To the west, you have French rationalism threatening to dissolve their traditions. To the north and west, you have British materialism saying, only what you can touch matters.
And Germany is sitting there, deeply religious, watching these two giants and thinking, we're going to lose our soul.
Exactly. They needed to defend their worldview. Specifically, they needed to defend theology. So thinkers like Kant, Fichte, and later Hegel, they used reason not to dismantle religion, but to build a wall around it.
So German idealism, all that complex stuff about the categorical imperative and the world spirit, that was a defense mechanism.
It was a fortress built by reason to protect God. Since they didn't have a unified state to give them identity, they built a unified system of thought. They created a sense of national unity in the mind because they couldn't yet create it on the map.
That is such a compelling way to frame it. It's not just abstract thinking for the fun of it. It's intellectual survival. They were trying to think their way out of being absorbed.
It is intellectual survival. And to really visualize this difference, the source uses this great image called the library test.
I love this section. It makes the abstract differences so concrete.
It really does. So I want you to imagine walking into a library in the mid-1600s. First, you walk into a library in London or Paris. What do you see on the shelves?
Well, based on what we just said, I imagine diversity. You've got theater, Shakespeare, Moliere are huge. You've got early science Newton, Bacon. You have political treatises like Hobbes. You have satire.
Exactly. The intellectual world is broad. People are reading about everything. Science, politics, art. Now, cross the border into a German principality during that same decade.
What do I see?
Almost nothing. You have to remember, Germany had just been devastated by the 30 Years' War. It was one of the most destructive conflicts in human history relative to the population. The economy was ruined. Culture was effectively paused.
So the shelves are empty.
There is effectively one book that the common person owns, reads, or hears. Luther's translation of the Bible.
That's it. Just the Bible.
For the vast majority, yes.
Yeah.
It was the only national book. It was the common language.
That has to rewire your brain. If you're a German intellectual growing up in that environment, your starting point is completely different from someone in London who's reading about optics or trade routes.
It's a completely different operating system. Because the Bible was the only shared text, any intellectual movement in Germany had to start with theology. You couldn't just jump to secular politics or mechanics. Nobody would understand you. You had to speak the language of God.
That explains so much. It explains why German philosophy is so entangled with religion. Even when they're talking about logic, it feels like they're talking about the divine.
They had to. They couldn't just talk about civil rights or gravity. They had to talk about spirit and duty. Those were the only concepts that had any currency in a society recovering from that level of trauma.
It's amazing how a war and a book can dictate the next 2 centuries of thought. But there's another specific date the source brings up that I'd never heard of as a turning point. 1567.
Yes, the year Thomas Aquinas was named a doctor of the church.
Now, to a layperson, that sounds like just some church bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Okay, he got a promotion. Why does that matter to this history of philosophy?
It was a line in the sand. By elevating Aquinas, the Church solidified a very specific version of Aristotle as the official way to think.
They basically said, this is how we do logic now, no deviations.
Right, and because it was so rigid, it eventually triggered a massive backlash. This is what we call the anti-Aristotle movement. But, and here's the key, the backlash didn't look the same everywhere. It was like a messy divorce where the three kids split the furniture.
That's a great image. So everyone rejects the official Aristotle, but they keep different parts of his work.
Exactly. Let's look at the UK again. They looked at Aristotle's study of nature, his physics, his biology, his observations of the physical world, and they said, let's keep the observation part, but strip away the theology.
We'll keep the plants and the animals, you keep the angels.
And that leads to the Royal Society, Newton, and modern science. That is natural philosophy. Now look at France. They took Aristotle's politics. They focused on his ideas about how a city-state should be run, how to organize a community, how to structure power.
Which evolves into their obsession with political science and rational administration. They kept the blueprint.
Correct. And then, poor Germany. They were left with the third piece, Aristotle's ethics.
They got the rule book.
They got the study of right and wrong, of purpose, of the soul's obligation. And because, as we established, they were already locked into a theological worldview, this obsession with ethics evolved into the German obsession with duty and the moral law.
So when Kant talks about the categorical imperative, that this idea that you have an absolute moral duty regardless of the consequences, that's just the great-grandchild of this split in 1567.
It is the direct lineage. The UK got science, France got politics, and Germany got ethics. And those foundational blocks defined what reason meant to each of them for centuries.
This brings us to what I think is the most provocative part of this whole deep dive. The so what question. Because when we go to college today and take a modern philosophy class, who do we read? We read Kant. We read Hegel. Maybe some Nietzsche. We basically read Germans.
Almost exclusively yes, when it comes to systematic philosophy.
And the source asks, if the UK and France were so advanced, they had industry, they had democracy, they had global empires, why are the Germans considered the kings of modern philosophy? Why didn't England produce a Hegel?
The answer is the twist. The source argues that the UK and France didn't have philosophy in the same sense, because they didn't need it.
That sounds almost dismissive, like saying they weren't smart enough to come up with it.
Not dismissive, functional. Think about what German idealism actually tries to do. It tries to explain the whole world, give it meaning, structure it, and unify it into one big system. It connects the self to the universe.
Okay, right.
France and the UK already had something that did that. They had functioning, unified states.
Oh, I see where this is going.
If you live in France, the state provides the structure. The law provides the unity. You know who you are, you're a citizen of France. If you live in the UK, the empire and the economy provide the meaning and the direction. You don't need a philosopher to build a system of the world, because you're already living in one.
But Germany.
Germany lacked a unified state. It was a patchwork. It was chaotic. So philosophy became a substitute for the state.
That is mind-blowing. So Hegel wasn't just writing a book. He was trying to build a country out of words.
Yes. Hegel's massive system where the spirit moves through history and realizes itself. That was essentially an attempt to build a spiritual state, because a physical one didn't exist yet. He was creating a national identity through pure thought.
It's like a scaffold. You build the building out of ideas first because you can't afford the bricks yet.
Exactly. Philosophy flourishes where the state is weak or where theology is in crisis but hasn't been replaced by politics yet. It steps in to fill the void. Ideally, a society finds its center in its institutions. Germany couldn't, so it found its center in its mind.
This really changes how I look at someone like Kant. He's not just a guy thinking hard in a room. He's doing the work that a constitution or a parliament would do in another country. He's legislating reality because there's no one else to do it.
And the source calls this the state replacement theory. And it offers proof. It suggests that once Germany actually unified, once it became a powerful nation-state later in the 19th century under Bismarck, that golden age of philosophy started to fade.
Because the substitute wasn't necessary anymore. They had the real thing.
Precisely. They traded the world spirit for realpolitik. They traded the books for the bayonets, essentially.
So let's bring this all together. We started with this puzzle of why these three neighbors were so different. We saw France using reason as a blueprint to overhaul society, leading to revolution. We saw the UK using reason as a tool to build an industrial engine, focusing on the practical. And we saw Germany building a fortress of reason to protect their theology and create a spiritual nation.
From the practical empiricism of the British to the political rationalism of the French, and finally, that deep, dense theological fortress of German thought.
And it all ties back to that title, Philosophy Cannot Walk Alone.
It really is the key takeaway. We tend to think of philosophy as this pure, independent pursuit of truth, floating in the clouds, totally detached from the real world. But this deep dive shows us that philosophy is always tethered. It's tied to the dirt, the wars, the economy, and the state of the nation.
It's reactive. It doesn't happen in a vacuum.
It is entirely reactive. When the state is stable and strong, pure philosophy tends to die out, or it transforms into something practical, like science or economics. It's only when there is a deep fracture, a missing state, a threatened religion, that you get these massive explosions of pure philosophical systems.
Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question to end on. If philosophy is just a substitute for a unified state, or a defense mechanism for theology, what does that mean for us today?
That is the big question. We live in a world that claims to be largely secular. Our states, for the most part, at least in the West, are stable and established. We have science for our truth, and we have laws for our ethics.
So, is true philosophy even possible anymore? Or was that golden age of German idealism just a one-time thing, a unique product of a specific historical struggle that we can never replicate?
If we are comfortable, do we lose the ability or the need to think that deeply? Perhaps we only really philosophize when we are homeless, intellectually speaking.
Maybe comfort is the enemy of insight. Something to mull over next time you pick up a dense book and wonder, why did they write this? Maybe it's because they had nothing else to hold on to.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.